Hello, my name is Sydney Rose Maubert. I'm currently teaching at Cornell University, and today I'll be discussing my research on the Black Seminoles and their relationship to the American South. The dispute over the origins of the Seminole is in full swing. In exploring these tensions, I don't wish to offer a comprehensive account of Seminole history or to recover their resistances, but rather to critically examine notions of visibility, humanism, worship, and their aesthetics. Etymologically, a maroon Seminole or a black Seminole is defined as a wild, untamed, or unruly fugitive. The term is attributed to the fugitive slaves of the Great Dismal Swamp, the Maroons of the Caribbean, or the Black Seminoles of Florida's Everglades. The untamed or unruly definition is attributed to the people rather than the unimaginable horrors of existence under slavery and genocide. The term maroon or Seminole is thought to be derived from the Spanish word cimarron, stemming from cimara, meaning thicket, and cima, meaning summit or peak. The Creek would reappropriate cimarron as cimanoli. While the term cimarron in all of its meanings signals a movement towards escape, it also indexes a particular porous ground and visibility or invisibility through the logic of the thicket. The thicket is productive in that it also conjures a kind of rhythmic, nonlinear process. The maroon then operates on a rhythmic schema. It is about a kind of movement with no clear entries or exits, with no clear space of escape, but rather is an ongoing process. Fugitivity here can be read as both an epistemic project and as a mode of fungibility, temporarily finding space of reprieve and terror outside of the logics of property. The escape or act of marooning yields new possibilities of transport, to echo Saidiya Hartman, and alludes to the captive body's fungibility through amending the body status of chattel to pleasured or tortured body. Capture and evasion allowed the Seminoles a new critical knowledge of the land, where places thought uninhabitable could be thought of as home. Marooning also taught challenge notions of ownership, surveillance, and capture, and approaches placemaking for Black and Indigenous folks. Miami's genesis is deeply steeped in African and Indigenous investments in intersectionality, solidarity, and oppression made in the entire racial project of Miami. Our ensemble includes the Gullahs, the Seminoles, and Bahamian rice farmers sailing within a day to South Florida. The Seminoles would build an alliance with the Spanish in resisting English forces, seeking to dominate Florida, migrating down from eastern Alabama and southern Georgia in the 1700s. The Spanish would eventually build a fort in 1743 and continue to populate the edge of Biscayne Bay and the Miami River with housing and farms. Several factors prompted Florida's earned reputation as a haven for freed slaves and maroons. First, the Spanish offered land grants to Bahamians along the Miami River. Second, rumors of gold and wealth lost in the Great Florida Reef would attract the attention of Bahamians interested in limited offers of freedom. And third, the siete partidas. Some would migrate from the Bahamas as plantation workers, and some would travel north from Key West, where they would work as carpenters and coral laborers. There, they would be met by Seminoles, an offshoot of Gullahs who were migrating south from the Carolinas and Georgia. The Spanish intended on manipulating their daunting Black and Indigenous presence to scare off the white American expansion into Florida, though this would ultimately not come to pass. Black and Indigenous alliance would lead to escalating tensions as time went on. This Black Seminole alliance was thought to be a problem, yielding new laws and religion. Spanish Florida's economy was shaped by competing slave systems of comparable development through chattel slavery and the forced imposition of colonial culture. The patterns of Black society in Florida evolved during Spain's first tenure in the province between 1565 to 1763, shaped by inter-ethnic relations and international politics. The earliest documentation of Black people in Florida dates from the early 1500s during the Spanish exploration and occupation of Hispaniola, Haiti. Today. Like the Spanish Caribbean, Florida suffered from indigenous genocide and a shortage of European labor, creating a dependence on Black labor and military. The Barbadian colonization of Carolina in 1670 created an 150-year battle between Spain's southeastern and Caribbean occupation over imperial control of the southeastern edge of America and created an international border that enslaved Africans and Native Americans alike, though it would provide opportunities for freedom. This geopolitical competition created leverage for slaves in Florida and greater Spanish dependence on free Black and Native people. Great Britain's tenure in the colony between 1763 to 84 temporarily eradicated the international border and transformed the landscape into one of possibility. The Seminoles would build an alliance with the Spanish in resisting these forces, seeking to dominate Florida, migrating down from eastern Alabama and southern Georgia as early as the 1700s. In October 1687, the first recorded fugitives from Carolina arrived in St. Augustine. Governor Diego Quiroga recorded that 8 men, 2 women, and a 3-year-old nursing child escaped by boat. Black and Indigenous alliance threatened the expanding capitalist economy and the preservation of Spanish order in Florida. Quiroga oversaw the fugitives' Catholic instruction, baptism, and marriage, refusing to return them to Captain William Dunlop, the Carolina Indian trader who arrived to recover them from 1688. The Siete Partidas, a code of 13th century law prepared by King Alfonso X, held that slavery was an unnatural condition under God and established ways in which the enslaved could become free and maintain protection of slave marriage and family under Catholic conversion. This would inspire the fugitives of Carolina to seek refuge and God in Florida. Thus, the issue of paternalism is framed by religious law's negation of the slave's will, their commodification, and violent domination of Black and Indigenous relations. King Alfonso fashioned himself the king of 3 religions, as the state governed Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Title 24, 25, and 26 concerned the Jews, Moors, and heretics, respectively. The law put forth that the people of different faiths dressing and living together in cities led to violence and evils, and so the social rights of Christians depended on a kind of self-fashioning, which the Black and Native populations took advantage of. Florida would garner a reputation as a safe haven for freed slaves and maroons through Spanish land grants. Rumors of lost treasure and limited offers of freedom would draw in Bahamians along the Miami River. Seminoles and Blacks would join forces to resist slave wranglers from West Oklahoma, aiming to re-enslave freed people. Some Seminoles, in cooperation with the British, were gifted slaves. Finding the whole concept alien, Seminoles treated their slaves as additional labor by giving them tools and materials to build their own houses, giving them corn to raise, asking them to produce no more than 10 bushels of corn for their own keep. This ownership and solidarity would yield a Creole culture, renaming the group the Black Seminoles. The refusal to participate under European respectable dictates or enlightenment deemed them demonic. This work aims to see how marginalization refracts within this modern dialectical framework, to see how marginal lives and ways of life begin to differ or lend insight to Christian ethics. It's thought, though these numbers are impossible to ascertain, roughly 388,000 African people were shipped to North America, with 210,000 being brought to the Carolinas and Georgia in the early 1500s. At this time, the Spanish declared absolute sovereignty over land extending from the Florida Keys to Newfoundland and west to Mexico. In 1526, the Spanish settlement of San Miguel de Gualdape, near Sapelo Sound, is speculated to be the first colony with several African slaves. Of the entire import, nearly 50% of the enslaved were taken to the port of Charleston. Many of the people there were initially rice farmers from West Africa, particularly Sierra Leone, taken as slaves to the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, and made contact with the Seminoles, diffusing through Florida, Oklahoma, Mexico, and Texas. Many of the enslaved were taken from Senegambia, and they were practicing Muslims. Today, traces of this past are maintained off the Georgia coast in Sapelo Island, where Islam was permeated the Black church, creating a kind of creolized Black Christianity. Melissa Cooper, a descendant and scholar of the Gullah Geechee people, would emphasize that fetishized attention turned on Sapelo Island's Gullah people during the 1920s and 1930s modernist voodoo craze. The writings of Alicia DeRock O'Brien would explain and complicate the origins of the Gullah people, that the Low Countries enslaved peoples of South Carolina and Georgia were drawn from windward or rice coast of Africa. until the abolition of chattel slavery. At this time, there was also a religious mixing of Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and African practices, which in Georgia is reflected as root, hoodoo, or voodoo. This different geographic story offers a more generous, intimate lens of Black movement rather than the marginalization of indigeneity and religious practice, which we see largely in academia. The religious and cultural miscegenation explains the role of vulnerability, domesticity, and fugitivity in the long tradition of involvement in Black spirituality, eliding the boundaries of the sexual and sacred, home and church, God and Lord. In an interview titled Haints, an unidentified woman recounts memories of hauntings in order to recontextualize spirituality within the morality of slavery in South Florida and trouble distinctions between the quotidian and the spiritual. She tells us her name was Josephine Anderson before she married Willis Jones, and for this reason, I'll refer to her as Josephine Jones. She details the materiality of her life in Sanderson, in Baker County, Florida. She describes her mother and her grandmother spinning all of her clothes in their spare time. She never remembered seeing her mother wear shoes, even in the winter, since the cold didn't hurt her feet any more than her hands and face. Joan's wedding dress was blue, and she was married in a courthouse, which was exceptional since most folks those days got married laying a broom on the floor and jumping over it, end quote. She explains, brooms kept the haints away, that when people would die, the devil sometimes don't want them in the bad place. He makes witches out of them and sends them back. Folks would place a broom on the front of their door to protect their homes. She explains that some of her family can see haints better than others. Her daughter, Teenie, was born with a veil or a caul over her face as a baby, and those babies could see spirits and tell what was going to happen before it came true. Although Jones conceded she couldn't tell nothing about slavery times except what was overheard, she nonetheless rendered the spiritual pulse of domestic life during this time. A haint or a haunt is a term that originated in the beliefs of the Gullah Geechee people of the Carolinas, Georgia, and North Florida. In this sense, Jones became the surrogate. She becomes the surrogate witness to pliable connections between the global South and the Middle Passage. She illuminates the ways that domestic life is spiritual through terms such as haint, veil, and natural, and more importantly, that the setting, most of her stories takes place in her bedroom or her daughter's bedroom. The inhabiting capacities are disclosed through the reiteration of her accounts of her daughter's hauntings and her grounding quarters as a site of possibility and ritual. Her husband would say that he was going to cure their daughter by taking a grain of corn and putting it in a bottle in her bedroom overnight. Then he'd plant it, and after 3 years of cultivation untouched, he'd roast them and feed them to Teenie. Teenie still saw haints, but she wasn't bothered by them. She drew the hoodoo of the Gullahs close, staging at least 4 more stories of haints dying or disappearing. But the last story she told, she had met a haint in her quarters. It hung its skin up on her bedroom wall, and it rode her to near death. She claimed she knew it because she was sweaty and out of breath, that anybody who didn't believe her certainly hadn't encountered a witch before. She says, only once. Soon as I wake up, I light a lamp and look on the floor. And there, side of my bed, was a dress, laying over that flaxseed. So she walked over on the dress, big as life. I snatch up the dress and throw it on the bed. Then I got to sleep. And I had never been bothered by any other haint no more. Home folks read the Bible backwards to keep witches from riding them, but that don't do me no good because I can't read. But flaxseed works so good I don't be studying night riding witches no more. The nature of her stories is complicated. She uses her bedroom and body as a phantasmic vehicle. For home, capable of being captured, is unsettling, frightful, and slippery. Haunting advances Joan's efforts to identify the spiritual with the quotidian. Because of the making of the haint tales, she recovers kinship in African and indigenous contact in the Americas. The latent sexuality of capture, of a body being stolen or mounted, speaks to an aesthetic disfigurement due to her Christian influence and the influence of hoodoo and the fungibility of the captive body. I am interested in the implications of haunting in her story, the connections between hoodoo and Christianity, between African and indigenous, and the tracings of geographic connections between the Gullah and the Seminole people. This next section is entitled Capturing God, the Creation Story in Miami's Everglades. For those forced into slavery and capture, the spectacle of romantic love in slavery was used to deny the pains of those sold or freed into nothingness. This was the case for Rose Forrester, the wife of Samson Forrester, a man born into slavery, stolen by the Seminoles, recaptured, and restored to his master. Samson was enslaved, belonging to a man named Forrester. Some years before the Seminole War of 1835, he was a small child stolen by Seminoles. He was recaptured and restored, quote, a tall and well-built man, skilled in the secrets of woodcraft and familiar with the haunts of the Seminole, end quote. His mother tongue returned to him, and he was perceived as an asset to the officers of Fort Brooks, where he operated as a scout and as an interpreter of the government. He was bought as a slave by the government and later employed at good salary. At the ending of the Second Seminole War in 1842, he was given his freedom, but retained by the government. He was responsible for deporting Seminoles to Louisiana and Arkansas. He would eventually fall in love with a woman named Rose, an attractive maid who belonged to Mrs. Kendrick, the wife of Captain William H. Kendrick. In a newspaper interview in 1883, Captain Kendrick was convinced that his courtship was something of a possession, that the captain sold his maid for $1,400 with the consent of his maid. Upon being told of the offer, the maid burst into tears and was willing. She was purchased in gold, and the pair left for Fort Brooks. These extravagant displays omit the distinction between surrender and willfulness in the strategic denial of pain. The interview of Samson Forrester was penned by an interviewer more concerned with seducing the reader than committing his spectacular life to paper. The terms of the seduction are shown in quotes like, lingered under the delicious influence of a pair of languorous dark eyes, possession rather than the pursuit of happiness, the strange performance of a previously normal heart, figure of a Venus in bronze, who, according to her master, was the most beautiful colored girl he had ever seen, end quote. This next section is entitled Those Who Chose the Ocean. The Maroons of South Florida generally lived in isolation from white people, other slaves, or indigenous people, and primarily focused on their original African traditions, though the Maroons made exceptions and joined forces with indigenous folks to protect the peninsula from additional colonizers or threats. Seminoles and Blacks would join forces to resist slave wranglers from West Oklahoma, aiming to collect and re-enslave freed people. From the Seminoles, who were in cooperation with the British, they were gifted slaves. Slavery would bear a distinctly different appearance under indigenous people, finding this whole concept alien. They more so treated them as additional labor by giving them tools and materials to build their own houses. The slave ownership and solidarity would yield the creation of a Creole or miscegenated culture of Black Seminoles. They would intermarry, have children, create shared dances. They'd have shared material and aesthetic cultures and linguistic changes, all informed by this new Creole culture. Colonial writings from the journals of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca observed a devilish thing of one man married to another, end quote. Seminoles ruptured gender roles often by sharing responsibilities and embracing their feminine and masculine energies during rituals. This gender equity was inherent to their culture, and their partnerships were not characterized by the subjugation of their partners under the violence of white hegemony, though they had gender roles. They provided shelter for runaway slaves and had largely no intentions of relinquishing Black people to white domination and violence. This group would be considered different from freed Blacks and Maroons, but their social stance was closer to that of an indigenous person. Indigenous people were often remarked as marginal, leading lives unconcerned with Great Britain, Spain, or French colonial rule. They would embrace more freedoms through this mixing. In many ways, they were marginal through their queerness, miscegenation, and protection of Blacks. The refusal to participate under European respectable dictates or Enlightenment deemed them demonic. And I'll end here. Thank you for your time.